Oh, now we're broadcasting. All right, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for the first CondoTalk webinar for the CCI Golden Horseshoe chapter. My name is Maria Durden. I'm a partner at Simpson Weichel Law and the chair of the Condo Practice Group. I'm also currently the president of the Golden Horseshoe chapter and the co-chair of the Education Committee. CondoTalk was created to provide short, free, informative, and practical solution-based webinars to condo owners, boards of directors, managers, and those who are servicing the condo industry in general. Our first CondoTalk Cash Flow, How Not to Become Bankrupt, will focus on some of the difficulties condos are facing nowadays because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we will also review a lot of practical solutions to help you and your condo during these financial hardship times. Please keep in mind that this is not intended to be legal advice, and you should be consulting with your individual condominium lawyers in that regard. Thank you so much to our sponsors who allow us in putting these kinds of free webinars available to you. Thank you to CWB Maxim Financial, Edison Engineers, Inc., and Switch. Just so you know, all of our presentation, the video as well as the slides will be available on the Golden Horseshoe Chapter website, so you will have access to the firm websites should you wish to access them later on. I'm also very excited to introduce to you an excellent lineup of speakers for this first Condo Talk. We have Richard Elia, a condo lawyer with Elia Associates, a firm that provides a full range of legal services to condos throughout Ontario. I also have the pleasure of serving with Richard on the Golden Horseshoe Chapter Boards of Directors, as well as a member of the Education Committee. Thank you, Richard. Jason Truman is the founder and president of Edison Engineers, Inc., and is a professional engineer and has over 25 years of engineering and construction experience. As well, Michelle Joy is a general license manager and registered condo manager and a director of condo management of Wilson Blanchard. Michelle is also a member of the finance and conference committees of the Golden Horseshoe chapter. So welcome to the speakers, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And we're going to jump right in, as we have about an hour to cover a lot of really good information. So let's start off with Jason, and let's hear from the engineer's perspective on this issue.
Thank you, Maria. And thanks for everyone who's joining us today. The purpose of my presentation is to provide you with an engineering perspective for managing your corporation's physical assets during this pandemic. I'll start by sharing a proven process that my team has developed and implemented hundreds of times over the past 10 to 15 years to help condo corporations manage projects at their buildings. This current pandemic has proven the success of this project and its adaptability to any situation, large or small. Next, I will share some new ideas and strategies we're seeing in the industry. And finally, I'll end my presentation with a few case studies from the past few months. The payoff of my presentation is that you will gain some new information to help you navigate this current pandemic environment and future projects at your building. So this is the first slide here. This is the reality for many condominium communities. Buildings are 20 to 40 years old and either entering into or partway through their building renewal cycle. This is when most of the major components of the building require repair or replacement. Boards have typically followed recommendations from the Reserve Fund study, but inevitably still find themselves with a shortfall to pay for major repairs. On top of that, there's often surprises. This is a high-rise condo that I worked on in the past couple of years. This roof failed very suddenly, about 10 to 15 years before the roof replacement was planned for in the Reserve Fund study. The photo on your left is an infrared image, which was able to detect areas of wet insulation below the membrane, and that's shown in yellow. 30 to 40% of the insulation was wet and water was actively leaking into the building. Since the roof was only 10 years old, the corporation didn't have enough funding set aside to cover the replacement cost. This was in addition to other major projects planned for at their community. This isn't the unfortunate reality for many condos. And now you layer on top of that COVID-19. You know, aging buildings require repairs, and now a global pandemic can really knock people's lives off balance. There are two choices for a board. They can face the issue head on, or they can choose to stick their head in the sand. Obviously, sticking your head in the sand is not confronting the crisis and will likely result in a worse result for your community. The first step when faced with a crisis is not to panic and to slow down. Most building repair projects are not an emergency, and I'm going to show you a way to take control of the crisis by following a proven process. As we have seen through this current unprecedented global pandemic, there was an initial crisis and reaction beginning with a lot of unknowns and a lot of fear. Concrete action was taken by many countries, and after only 3 months, our lives are slowly starting to get back to normal. As an overarching concept, I want you to keep this photo in mind. In any situation, as stakeholders and decision makers, you want to be in the driver's seat. It's not a good feeling to be facing any crisis, but especially when you're not in control. This is why following a defined process or roadmap is so important. So here's a 30,000-foot view of the process. It starts with triggers. Major repairs can be planned or unplanned. Even if they are planned, the cost can be higher or the project is required sooner. The current global pandemic and resulting economic slowdown is another triggering event. In all cases, it's critical to communicate with residents immediately and often, and then follow this two-pronged approach: project planning and financial planning. Project planning involves first a condition assessment to determine the extent of any issue and to develop options for repairs. Once an option is selected, your engineer will prepare a scope of work package and tender the work to qualified contractors to obtain competitive pricing. Financial planning involves updating your reserve fund study, first with information from the condition assessment to explore various funding scenarios, and secondly, once actual pricing is received, to confirm the actual impact. We encourage a minimum of 2 town hall meetings during this process. During the current pandemic, we recommend proceeding by video and teleconference. Platforms such as GoToWebinar, Microsoft Teams, and Zoom are all effective and allow residents to join by video or by phone. The first meeting is designed to share condition assessment findings and options. At this point, the board is not presenting any decisions. This is very critical. By presenting only facts about the situation, it allows residents to absorb the information, ask questions, and provide feedback, keeping you in control of the message. The second meeting is to share board decisions based on that resident feedback and actual pricing. Finally, we have the implementation phase, which has many multiple communication parts during construction. This unprecedented event has affected condos very differently, depending on the demographics of their communities. Most everyone is stressed and very concerned about their health and the health of fellow Ontarians. Some communities are faced with financial challenges as working age residents experience layoff and changes in work. As a condo community, you can help reduce some of the financial stress by reviewing your reserve fund study. Can your study handle lower contributions over a period of few months, maybe a full year? What is the impact on long-term balances? Can the shortfall be made up over the next few years? In our experience thus far, most communities are deciding to stay the course. We've helped a few communities explore the option of lower contributions so they can demonstrate to owners that they're reviewing all options. Some boards have elected to actually lower contributions temporarily, especially if they were facing pretty large increases. Here's an example cash flow table showing minimal impact of a 50% annual reduction in reserve contributions. This board elected to cancel transfers to the reserve fund study for 6 months to provide some financial relief to residents. The top table is showing the next 5 years of their original plan, and the bottom table is showing a reduction of 49%, which is highlighted in red, then jumping back to the original plan the next year. Over the long term, we found that there was only a marginal difference in reserve balances. COVID-19 has led many communities to consider deferring or even canceling projects. This decision is being made for a few reasons based on what we've seen. First is resident safety. The project is going to be indoors, intruding on owner space. Projects we've seen like this are window replacement projects or corridor refurbishments. The next one is optics. The board's asking themselves, how can we justify spending money now when so many residents are suffering financially? Won't this look callous? A third one we're seeing is fear. So instead of making a decision, some boards are just deciding to pause everything, just put the stop button on all projects. When making a decision to defer projects, we're recommending to boards, don't panic. Back to our don't panic slide. Slow down and make a rational decision. Review your reserve fund study to check the financial impact. Next, have your engineer review the impact on building performance. Many projects are going to be straightforward. A 1 to 2 year deferral is not going to result in any major issues. Some deferrals, though, may require maintenance repairs to mitigate damage to the building or to address safety concerns, such as water leaks, corrosion, deterioration of structural elements. In these cases, proactive repairs to reduce risks may be required, including sealant repairs, roof thermographic scanning, localized repairs, and/or implementing a monitoring program. Review these requirements with your engineer. There are also cost risks to consider. There's currently a slowdown in repair activity. There's lots of owners in the industry stopping projects or canceling and deferring them. At the same time, buildings continue to age and deteriorate. Combined, this is creating a backlog of required repairs. Once the economy starts back up again, demand's inevitably going to increase and costs could rise significantly. Let's look at some strategies that we're encouraging boards to consider. When considering these strategies, we need to go back to our restoration process, which includes project planning process of condition assessment, step 1, bid documents and specifications and tendering, that's step 2, and the construction phase, which is step 3. Project planning can take many months or years, depending on the project size and material lead times. We are currently encouraging boards to continue the project planning work now during the crisis. You can start with the preparation work by completing those condition assessments or feasibility studies. You can continue with the design and prepare a specification package. Tender the work now or maybe in a month or so to obtain that competitive pricing. At this point, once you have that pricing, you have all the information required to make an informed and educated decision. The board is in control and can decide whether to defer the work or proceed. Pricing work now may take advantage of low pricing from contractors and will ensure that your project is first in line when the construction activity begins or when you as a board decide to make that decision to begin the project. If you have money in your reserve fund study, the board can leverage that money to get work done now when contractor pricing may be lower. It may even be worth bringing a project forward or borrowing money given the current environment of low interest rates. So let's look at a few projects that we've had over the past few months. This first one is a sloped roof replacement project. We encouraged the board to proceed with tendering, and they received a 40% savings based on our cost estimates and other bidders on this particular project. The board agreed to proceed with the base scope of work and actually added 2 additional phases which were planned for future years. And they were able to achieve the same unit rate for those phases. Their decision to continue during the crisis has saved this corporation $100,000. Our second example is a project involving waterproofing replacement on terraces. We completed a mock-up repair late last year and plan to tender the work late this winter. There were 4 bidders, plus the contractor that completed the mock-up. The work was tendered at the beginning of March, just as the government restrictions and closures came into effect. The board considered stopping the project. We advised them to continue with tendering, to slow down because no decisions had to be made. We will start the project when we're able, but don't stop the process now. The board agreed with us. The pricing came in at the end of March. The mock-up contractor came in 20% higher than the lowest bidder. What we found, though, is that there was an error in that low bid pricing. When asked about it, they preferred just to be disqualified. They were uncomfortable with proceeding based on the price submitted. Not knowing the low bid pricing, we gave the mock-up contractor a chance to reprice the work. Given the closure of construction at that time, this was in late March, early April, and the lack of work that they were foreseeing, they lowered their price by 20% and came in just under the original low bid. The board approved the work, and the work will be going ahead very shortly. They've got an excellent contractor who's already familiar with the work at a great price. Our final example on our final slide is here. The image you see is a 3D rendering that we prepared for a large window replacement project. The renderings are done as part of the design phase to help the board select the new window layout, configuration, and frame color. Again, tendering was done during the pandemic and closed at the end of April. This is a massive project, and it came in 30% below our estimates and will save the corporation $4 to $5 million. They now have a decision to make. Do they proceed or do they wait and risk pricing the work out again in 2 to 3 years? This may be an opportunity for them to borrow funds to complete the project while they have such competitive pricing. We're meeting with the board in the next few weeks to discuss their options. What would you do if you were in their shoes? Thanks, that's all I have.
Thank you, Jason. Very informative. I like the perspective because I think the go-to instinct is save, 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 don't spend, or it's going to cost us more. But I think it's nice to kind of see the other side of the fact that interest rates are lower, that perhaps those are actual options for some corporations. One question that I've been receiving is legal counsel, and I'm sure Richard has as well, is reserve fund contribution studies. Are they cast in stone? And you mentioned you can reassess contributions to a certain amount or hold off contributions to certain components. What would be your recommendation for boards of directors who want to consider reassessing their contributions or not completing a job right now? What is the best strategy to approach the idea of reassessing contributions to reserve fund studies?
Yeah, I think it goes if we go back to our recommended process, it works for decisions of all sizes. So the first step is always to communicate, is our recommendation. So you can let the residents know that the board's, considering this as part of their, as part of their approach to helping the community out. So we recommend letting everybody know. And the next step would be just to talk to your reserve fund planner and have an idea about what you're asking for, like what exactly you're looking for. Is it a reduction of a certain amount in your reserve fund study? Is it a deferral of certain projects? Will that help us? So just kind of understand what you want to achieve out of it, and then make sure you're asking for options. Like, here's what we're thinking, but as a reserve planner, as a professional in the industry, let us know what you think. Give us some other options that we can consider for our community.
Yeah, certainly you see a lot of corporations in your practice, so you'll have that background knowledge to share with them as well.
That's right.
And as in all things condo, communication is key. It does resolve a lot of issues.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Jason. Much appreciated. We might have some more questions at the end of the presentation for you. But at this time, we are going to move to Michelle Joy to give us the management perspective on this issue.
Thank you, Maria. Just set up my screen. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to touch on the management side of things, as Maria noted. So living in the COVID-19 pandemic has forced boards and management to look at financials very differently and definitely be more strategic in their spending. Many people across the province are out of work and may be struggling to meet their financial commitments. Although boards and management should be sensitive to this matter, at the end of the day, they still have a responsibility to effectively run the corporation. So I'm going to be highlighting four different areas. We're going to talk about common element fees, chargebacks and other non-common element fee payments, budgets, and lightly touch on special assessments as well. So common element fees, that's what runs the corporation. That's the funds you collect in order to pay all of your bills and all of your expenses. Common element fees, regardless of the COVID-19 pandemic, must still be collected. There's no other funds coming in, or if there are, they're not enough to cover the annual operations of the corporation. The corporation is not a bank or lending institution and unfortunately can't defer collection of condo fees without putting a financial strain on the corporation. So what options do the board have to offer their owners? Fees are due on the 1st of every month. However, owners will not be in a lien position until they approach the 90-day period in arrears. While we do not want to encourage owners to be consistently in default of their payments, this unfortunately may be a reality for some. What we would recommend is considering applying the FIFO method, first in, first out, when collecting fees for those who seem to be struggling to make their monthly payments. This means that the most recent payment is being applied to the oldest outstanding amount, and hopefully keeping the owner in arrears, but not approaching the 90-day period where they may reach a notice of lien or registered lien position. So you may have owners sitting in 30 to 60 days arrears for several months if they are struggling financially, but at least you're not proceeding to the lien position where they are facing additional costs for the legal fees associated with that process. Most corporations do have a 90-day lien policy, although we have come across some that have a 30 or 60-day policy. They may have put that in place because they were having ongoing issues with collections of arrears, or they don't have a lot of cash flow to let arrears go to 90 days. During this time, we would recommend that most corporations consider going to the 90-day lien policy. Again, that's what the Condo Act calls for. That's the longest outset that you can wait before liening. And it just is a little more sensitive to owners' needs during this time. That being said, you must still proceed with the notice of lien if you do have an owner approaching the 90-day period. My recommendation would be that if there are some concerns, speak with your corporation's lawyer about the process, and definitely make sure that the charge that you are proceeding with is actually lienable. Not every charge that the corporation charges back to an owner is lienable, so you'd want to ensure that that is the correct charge before proceeding and adding any costs to additional costs to the owners. If an owner is liened, if it can't be avoided and they do have to be liened, and the owner is still struggling financially, recommend that they speak with their mortgage company or their lender. A lot of the times the mortgage company will help assist with covering arrears and liens. They'll pay and then they work it out with the mortgage payments, and it clears the owner's account with the condo corporation. I believe Richard's going to touch a little bit more on the lien process during his presentation, so I won't get into detail about the specifics of that. Chargebacks and other non-common element fee payments. So one thing that I'm experiencing a lot as a manager and working with my boards is enforcement issues. Balancing, kind of what Jason talked about, balancing, the sensitivity, but also still maintaining your corporation. So one of the big things that I've come across during this time is visitor parking. We all know visitor parking is one of the biggest issues in condo corporations, 200 unit townhouse site, and they've given you 10 parking spaces for all your visitors, and owners are parking there, and it's an ongoing issue in many corporations. So a lot of boards don't want to not enforce visitor parking because it just kind of becomes a free-for-all again. But at the same time, you kind of have to be sensitive to ticketing, towing, and legal enforcement, and all the additional costs associated with that. So my recommendation is try and resolve matters amicably or communicate effectively with the owners who are in violation of any rules before having to go to the legal enforcement, which, you know, most legal letters run easily a few $100s, you know, for enforcement. So that would be charged back to the owner. So try and balance the line of not letting rules fall completely by the wayside, but also, you know, be somewhat sensitive to the fact that there's additional costs involved and not everybody may be able to meet them. In specific regard to visitor parking, most municipalities weren't even enforcing visitor parking. You know, if you were parking on a city street in Halton or Hamilton area, there wasn't even bylaw officers out enforcing city parking. So, you know, if the city's not enforcing parking, it's a little bit tough for the corporation to, you know, be very strong about that as well. If you do have an expense that must be charged back, for example, an insurance deductible. Mrs. Jones runs her sink, gets a phone call, her sink overflows, floods 2 units, and she's now on the hook for the $10,000 insurance deductible for the corporation. First thing to do is definitely communicate with the owner, explain why they will be responsible for the chargeback and what that process entails. And the first step I always recommend is having the owner speak with their personal insurance policy to see whether or not they have any coverage for deductible chargebacks. So a lot of the time, if you charge back, you know, chargebacks are going anywhere from $10,000, $15,000, $25,000 for water loss now. The owner may be able to pay a small deductible, such as $1,000, and their insurance will pay the rest to the corporation. So that's definitely the first step in speaking with the owner and seeing if they have that type of coverage. If that's not an option for them and they are going to be personally responsible for the amount, I would speak with the board and the owner to see if there's some sort of payment plan that can be arranged. Again, you're still going to have to watch for that 90-day lien period, but see if there's some way you can work with the owner to do a 90-day payment plan to help ease the financial strain of those costs. Again, owner may want to speak with their mortgage company to see if there's any way they could assist with covering the cost as well. Budgets. So I've worked with several corporations that have implemented a new budget since March of 2020. It's been a difficult topic for boards to navigate. Again, they're trying to ensure that they meet the financial needs of the corporation, but also be sensitive to the financial strains that their owners might be facing. So if your corporation is in the middle of drafting their new fiscal year budget, or it's something that they're going to be doing in the near future, what are some of the options you have? So my biggest thing, and Jason touched on it, communication. Communication is key. If you know that you're going to have significant increases that are unavoidable, communicate that as soon as you can to owners. Don't send out a 20% budget increase 20 days before the new budget takes place. Communicate throughout the process and let owners know why the costs are going up, why they can't be avoided, when the payments are going to start being due. I find as much as you can communicate in advance, owners are much more receptive to whatever is coming their way. Review the expenses. The budget process is always detailed. You're always sitting down and reviewing the expenses, but perhaps there are some projects that were planned for this year that can be deferred until next year. Are there any services that have been canceled, deferred because of COVID-19 that could also possibly help reduce expenses? For example, many corporations complete twice a year garage or window cleaning. You may have missed your spring garage or window cleaning due to the restrictions on maintenance. So this year you're only doing one cleaning. You may be able to save some costs there. Put new work or existing contracts that are expiring out to tender. See if there are any savings by obtaining multiple bids or switching to a new contractor that you haven't previously worked with. Encourage more owners to sign up for electronic communication. This is a huge savings on printing and mailing costs. It's a great way for the corporation to save money. You know, those 20-page AGM booklets. It's a great way to just save on costs and help reduce the budget increase as well. You can also consider volunteers in your community for services you may have previously paid for. So for example, landscaping, seasonal gardening, you may have some volunteers that would be willing to purchase and plant, you know, the annual flowers that you put in your common area gardens. The big takeaway here, though, is please ensure that any individuals or volunteers you have working on the property are properly insured. So speak with your insurance broker or your insurance company before just allowing the volunteers to work. You want to ensure you have proper liability coverage. But that may be, instead of, you know, paying your landscaper an hourly rate to plant the flowers, you may have some volunteers that are willing to help out with those costs. The other option is lending or loans. Some financial lending companies are offering short-term loans for smaller amounts. So it may not be like $1 million loan for a window replacement project, but, you know, a smaller $40,000 loan that might help cover an operating cost that once was going to be funded by special assessment or the large insurance increases we're seeing. When you're looking at a loan, you're going to want to speak to obviously the lending company to see what they can offer, but also ensure you're speaking with your corporation's lawyer to determine if a borrowing bylaw would be required. And lastly, speak with your reserve fund planner. As Jason touched on, there are just some options that may be available to your corporation that may help you lower your contributions and offset the increase to your budget. Another thing to consider, which isn't really a cost savings, more so a cost increase, is that many services and the cost of many services may be increasing in the future due to the increased amount of cost associated with those contractors obtaining PPE and sanitizing products in order to do their job. So your HVAC contractor that goes in and does your twice a year spring and fall fan coil heat pump service now requires masks, gloves, shoe coverings, face shields, whatever else it is. All of those are an additional cost to the contractor that, quite frankly, are likely going to be put onto their client through contract renewals or quotes. So that's something else to keep in mind, is the additional cost for all the PPE and sanitizing that is required now. Lastly, I just want to say, understand your community. While there may be some who appreciate deferring the big landscaping enhancement project that you had planned for this year in order to keep condo fees low, you may also have some communities that are not financially strained and would be happy to proceed with the status quo. So I think understanding your community is also a key concept here. Not every condominium is the same. Not every owner is the same. So keep that in mind, understanding your demographic and your community and their wants and needs during this time. The last thing I just want to quickly touch on is special assessments. Probably one of the most feared terms amongst board and owners, the dreaded special assessment. Many corporations pride themselves on never having to require a special assessment payment from their owners. Unfortunately, this is not a reality for all corporations. During a pandemic, when everybody, it could be financially strained, just consider how necessary the special assessment is. Can it be avoided? Are there other options such as loans or deferring the project? Again, speak with your reserve fund planner, your lawyer, financial lending companies. But again, I'm going to say, assess your community. There may be some that are more than willing to pay the special assessment. There may be some that, there would be a requisition meeting to remove the board if you put one through at this time. So just consider those options. Lastly, I just want to say, ultimately, the board and management should always try and be empathetic when working with unit owners. However, at the end of the day, the role is to responsibly manage the corporation in accordance with the Condominium Act and ensure it meets its financial, legal, and physical maintenance responsibilities. As managers, we need to work with boards to help navigate the new normal that we're all living and working in and ensure that the corporation is still being run well, but also effectively communicate with unit owners about expectations during this time. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. Very good information. We actually have a question on our Q&A online. And the question is, do you have any tips on how to encourage owners to communicate online versus in paper format, especially nowadays when maybe some managers can't attend or won't attend properties or owners don't want anyone near their unit? How can you encourage people to communicate electronically?
Yeah, so the biggest thing we're working with in our communities is setting up an email distribution list. Most people are on email now, so thankfully with the order that the government put in with condominiums, you can deliver notices without having the consent during this emergency period. So there is a legal form typically that owners need to agree to receive notices electronically. During this time, with the order in place, you don't need that. So if you have emails on file, that's definitely the key thing I'm pushing for. But again, it's not a reality for all people. Some of my corporations, it's not electronic, but they've put up a notice board in the lobby. So that's another thing. It's just a central place for communication to go if a lot of your community is not online. Some also have a website, so depends on if you're a website corporation as well.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that during the order period, you can communicate electronically without getting that consent. But I would expect that be encouraged to get that. So then after that order period, you can continue in that way. And hopefully people will be encouraged to do it because they'll see the benefit of it. I think it benefits both management, boards, as well as owners, because there's just faster communication of information.
Yeah, that's what we're pushing now is how quick and efficient it is. Right.
Sometimes too efficient, maybe. One last question for you is, do you think that, or when you're accommodating specific owners because of financial hardship, or you said you know your community, when you do accommodations for owners, does it have to be the same accommodation for every owner, or do you take every instance on its face? How do you deal with that?
So I think ultimately the board's responsibility is to treat all owners equally and fairly. So I think you need to take that principle and apply it to all owners. However, each accommodation could be different. Owners' situations could be unique. So it may be a payment plan over 90-day periods for some. It may be, speaking with the mortgage companies for others. So the accommodation or what you're doing could be different, but I think boards need to approach it fairly. But at the end of the day, every owner is still going to be subject to that 90-day lien period. So you can't not lien one owner and lien the other because of a circumstance. That has to be applied fairly to everyone.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Michelle.
Thank you.
Now we'll move on to Richard to get some legal recommendations. I won't use the word advice or opinions. Richard?
Perfect. Thank you very much. Michelle and Jason have been talking about objects and duties of the corporation on the operating side, on the reserve side, talking about flexibility and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to the performance of the objects and duties of the corporation. Even if we can find flexibility and ways to modify budgets and reserve fund contributions, it still comes down to the condo has to perform. Michelle said it very well at the end of her presentation. I can't remember the exact words, but show empathy, but it's got to operate according to the act, something to that effect. I think Michelle said. So when we're talking about performance of objects of the corporation, the cost of this is your common expense. These are your common expenses. This is how the act defines common expenses in section 1 of the act. It's not a penalty or a fine. It's not revenue in a commercial venture. Every owner that buys into a condo there's a prearranged agreement that owner is going to contribute towards the community and towards the community costs, the shared costs. If somebody doesn't pay, the community has a problem because it's got to be covered over somehow, or an interest might be compromised. And this is where I'm going to spend some time on the lien process, because this is where the lien comes into effect. It's such an effective and efficient tool when it's not compromised. And part of what gives that effectiveness and efficiency is what's called super priority. When the condo has that lien, it jumps the queue over priority, over pre-existing creditors. There's actually a section in the act that puts the mortgagees in default, but the legal process itself has to be followed. So in the legal process, we have to recognize who the various parties are, and we've got to balance the interests of all of these parties. Obviously, we've got the owner in arrears, and especially in the new normal that we're living in, to come down hard is difficult. But there are other interests that also have to be taken into account. We've got the corporation. The corporation has the obligation to take steps. So the corporation's got to somehow collect collect the fees to carry it out, its duties and obligations. And we've got all the other owners. Well, how do they come into play? If the process is somehow compromised, and it becomes uncollectible, or there are legal costs which escalate, which are uncollectible, ultimately, if the condo pays, then the rest of the owners pay. That's how condos work. And then possibly, not to be understated, are the third-party interests. These, these are the banks, the mortgagees, first, second, third mortgages, which we see on title. Any other creditors? A recent case with an estranged spouse registering a family law claim on the matrimonial home. It did not show up as the owner on title. It was just a notice, and this had to be reflected. And we've got to balance all of these interests because they all have a right in this process. What we don't want to do, and this I think is very important, if we compromise any of the interests involved, we can end up in court. We don't want to end up in court. All right, court is inefficient, it's expensive. If it's unnecessary, you're not going to recover. We don't want to fight over priority. The priority issues should be clear cut. So we don't want to get into that fight. We don't want to spend money that we can't collect, obviously. And lastly, we don't want to have to write off any debt. To go over the timeline, again, Michelle touched on this a little bit. As soon as that first payment is missed, there's what's called a statutory lien. This is automatic. It just happens, under the Act. And then if your managers would then, if there's a staff certificate requested, the staff certificate has to be updated at that point. Section 5 asks the question, are there any arrears, and has the unit been liened? Well, there are arrears, but it hasn't been liened at that point. Best practices are reminder letters. All right, use the reminder letters. Really, really important. I'm going to go over this in a little bit further. Then we have the beginning of the legal process, which begins with a notice of lien, and we have the end of the legal not the end of the legal process, but to perfect lien is registration, and that's got to be done before the end of the 90-day period, because that's when the statutory lien stops. All right, again, as Michelle said, some condos have a more aggressive process. There's nothing illegal about it. I think it's a bit harsh in today's climate, but you've got to get that lien perfected before the end of that three-month period. So some ideas here. When you do the notice of lien, what used to be called the Form 14, the Act now requires that you search title. It used to say you send it to the name and the address for service in the condo's register. That changed. It did not change with a lot of fanfare, so it tends to get overlooked. But that recent case involving the Family Law Act claim fell victim to this, so to speak, in that spousal claim under the Family Law Act did not get a copy, did not get this the Form 14 notice of lien, and the court held that spousal interest ought to be recognized at this early stage, which means you're doing a formal search of title at this stage, and you're sending out notice. Now, if you're doing this, why not include everybody else? You've got the encumbrances, the banks, you got guarantors, anyone else that you might find. And just, the Act says you've got to send, for example, notice to the banks by registered mail before the lien goes on. It doesn't say how early you have to send. There's no restriction on how early. It just has to be done on or before the date the unit's linked. So why not send it at the notice of lien stage? It's just adding another addressee. That's really all it is. It's very little additional work. You send regular and registered mail because banks require registered, but the owner is just regular, and it goes out. When you get to the end of the third month, all you have to do, again, very efficient, is just search the last instrument. It's very quick. If there's no change in the last instrument, you register, update the status certificate, and your lien is perfected. You're on solid ground at this point. And once you're perfected, then the condo has a lot more flexibility on how it then goes forward. But you don't want to mess with making sure that you are perfected, because that's compromising the process. I don't, Maria, I'm sure you can comment on this further, or as far as how your firm is. In our firm, we're seeing, since we shifted to this process, we're seeing 70% of the files clear up before we even lien it. So what that is very efficient for the condos. The condos are maintaining its cash flow, and it needs the cash flow. The lending is going back to the banks because the banks are in the business of lending. The condo's not. And the condo is, and the community is not being compromised at all in this.
It is, and I would add, Richard, that it's in the lender's best interest to have the unit up to, having paid all their common element fees, because it's their investment as well. So I agree with you. I think get them involved right at the forefront and get it resolved. Don't wait until the point where you're about to sell a unit and then tell the mortgage company, hey, are you interested? Deal with it from the beginning.
Yeah, and there's a whole body of case law out there involving banks where the interest of the bank has been compromised. And what are they arguing over? They're arguing over the legal fees that the condo has incurred in pursuing collection.
Yeah.
All right. So, and the condo is not in that business of lending. So yeah, I agree. The banks do want to get involved, and typically they do. So some COVID related ideas on collecting. I'll start with the no's. The payment holidays, unless you're amending your budget to say this month we're not collecting from anybody, and then you're collecting more down the road. And I'm not aware of any condo that's actually done this. You can't do it. We hear about banks giving payment holidays on mortgages. That's an entirely different thing. That's that's their business. So the condo is not in that lending business. There's no interest component per se on regular common expense payments. So you can't do it. Extending timelines. There was the emergency order that got issued about extending limitations, and no one quite knows how that's going to play out with condos. You ask 5 lawyers, you get 5 different opinions on it. I don't want to be acting for the condo that's going to take this to court. I want the condo's position to be perfected. I don't think it's in the interest of the condo to take a chance on this. And again, for any particular unit, doing this by creative agreement, we've heard discussion of creative agreements, unless you get all those parties involved. So the owner in arrears, the condo, every other owner, all the mortgagees, the spousal interest, whatever else is out there. I don't see how you can even consider one of these agreements, because a creative agreement that would extend the deadline for payment is either saying bank or condo, you're now lending money, which is illegal under the act, or it's impacting the interests on all the other parties. The maybes, the budget adjustment, and the reserve fund funding plan adjustment. Michelle and Jason touched on these, and you've got to speak to them and see, is there room? Can something be deferred? The thing that always comes back to me is if you defer today, you're paying more tomorrow. And the economic reality that COVID's presenting is not going to be gone tomorrow. Everything I'm reading is putting it out at least a year and a half. We've got to be thinking long term in this. So what do I like to see? Those warning letters, the reminder letters, where I take these really seriously. Send them to everybody. If you know someone with an interest in the condo or in that unit, send it out. Make sure it's actually addressed to the owner, not the occupant. Make sure you keep track of what the names and addresses are, and not just dropped off at the unit. Make every effort to do these properly. Encourage part payments. Or again, Michelle touched on this. If you can keep it under the 3-month limitation, keep it out of legal. It's great. It's working with your community. But once you hit that threshold, don't mess up the legal process, because that is really key to that efficient collection process for all parties. Engage third parties as soon as possible. Now, when a unit gets purchased, I think every set of mortgage instructions I've ever seen requires that I send the condo details as to who the mortgagee is, all right, the name and address of the bank. And the act says this is a record of the condo. So if you've got this information, and I know there's a disconnect somewhere in the process here. If the condo has this information, send the reminder letters not only to the owner, but also to the bank. Because again, as soon as that statutory lien starts, it puts the bank in default. So the bank's got an interest they should know right from the get-go. We've started asking banks to pay it forward. Or again, banks are in the interest of lending money to condos, not if an owner has just got no ability to pay because of COVID, and the bank steps in, great, they're going to pay it off after they get notice in the third month, and then the arrears are going to start again. It's just going to be a 3-month cycle. So why not ask the bank to pay a couple of months forward? Maybe that's what the owner needs just to get back on his or her feet to be able to pay, and then again add it to the mortgage ideally. Adjusting the interest rate. No requirement on this, but again, empathy. The interest rate for condo arrears is typically set high, 18 to 24% is very, very usual. And that's because it's not a lending rate, all right? It's a deterrent. So if you've got a situation where owners can't, or an owner can't pay, and you want to make things a little easier, the board does have the authority to, to do this in my view. Post-registration protocols. I said after the lien is registered and the condo's position is secured, the condo then has flexibility. So if our pre-COVID protocol were 2 monthly reminders and then power of sale, we're now going to 3 monthly reminders, then power of sale. It extends it an extra month. It's something. It's not great. I acknowledge, but bottom line is that debt still has to be collected. You cannot simply register a lien and let it sit. The last one, it's not really a post-COVID or pre-COVID. It's just, to me, something that's lacking in a lot of condos are the indemnity provisions to allow for chargebacks, to clarify and strengthen the ability to charge back. We want to charge back because we want to make somebody accountable if their actions caused an expense in the condo. We've got to be able to find that authority either in the act or the declaration, and most declarations are really deficient when it comes to this. For example, the compliance letters. To be able to charge back for the compliance letter, you have to have the indemnity in the declaration that allows you to charge back for steps taken to affect compliance with the Act, Declaration, Bylaws, and Rules. The standard indemnity is property damage. That's the standard one. So we can't use that for compliance for those compliance letters. So we really have to be careful. Otherwise, again, if we're told to lean on for that type of chargeback, then the condo risks wasting money and it becoming uncollectible, et cetera, et cetera. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Richard. To piggyback on your chargeback comments, I'm sure it's the same practice in your firm as well, is that, we'll have corporations come to us and ask for a compliance letter and then tell the owner they have to pay for it. And so my first question is, well, do you have that authority? And so we start going through the declaration to see what that indemnification provision and how it's worded. Sometimes what I've seen is that it says it's a breach of the rules and regulations, then you can charge it back, but nothing about a breach of the declaration or bylaws. So it's also limited. So it's very, very specific wording you're looking for. And then you want to tell the board, yes, you can charge it back, or no, you can't. You can ask them to pay it and see if they do, but you don't necessarily have the legal authority to charge it back against their unit.
My challenge is, if the indemnity is in the bylaws or the rules, very common, it doesn't help lien rights. All right, that's why when you go to court, you want to have that extra authority when you go to court. If I'm when I get instructions to do a compliance letter, the expectation is that that's going to go out yesterday. All right, it's got to be done very fast. If we're giving feedback on whether you can lien for it or not, first off, that's a legal opinion, which I don't like giving away. Sorry. Second, if I do comment on it, and I comment too forcefully, I used to be very forceful about this, then basically the client would then send the work to Maria's office or some other law. So we do try, like when we do the collection letter, we go through the declaration of bylaws and rules and we pick it up at that point, but the work's done at that point. All right, so the letter goes out, and then it's more after the fact. You can't really insist on this.
Yeah.
I don't know that I wish the instructions, 20 years ago, the instructions would come in, just send it out, and in the extreme case would be charged back for it. Today, it
Yeah.
seems most of them say charge back for it, which is really unfortunate. That's a
It is, but
that's a different
yeah.
topic for CondoTalk.
It is a different topic, and possibly another good one we'll have in the near future, because there's certainly a lot of confusion out there as to what you can charge back and what you can't, and should you still proceed with the compliance letter if you can't.
Yeah.
So we can certainly discuss that on a later date. But I do have one question for you, Richard, and that is, you discussed a couple of options. Well, some were clearly no, some were maybe, and some were yes. How does the condo decide which way they should go with? Like, there's a couple there.
Yeah, and nothing. There's no one size fits all. I like the idea of the budget or reserve wiggle room, but obviously you'd want to talk to Michelle or Jason or whoever your Michelle and Jason equivalents are, and hopefully the financials are solid where you get a clear picture, and the future, there's some predictability about what you're expecting. The warning letters to me can apply to almost, unless someone's dropped the ball and you're already in the third month. There's no reason why not to do the warning letters. Where I see a challenge coming up with these is the information about the mortgagee. Because I find that many times the condo does not have this information. And my guess, I'm not saying anybody's perfect, but my guess, perhaps it may not be sent in. I don't know.
Okay.
We all know it's up to the unit owner, or the unit owner's lawyer, to send in the name and address for service of the owner. All right, the name and address for service of the mortgagee is also supposed to be sent in. When it is, it forms part of the condo's records.
Yeah, you're right. Supposed to and is are two different things, unfortunately, sometimes in the condo industry. So I think, what you're saying is, it sounds like it's a team approach. So you work with your manager, if you have one, your reserve fund provider, your legal counsel, to see what best suits your corporation. It's not a one size fits all, or pick and choose. But you have to look at, like Michelle said, know your community, know what it can sustain and what it needs in the near future. Like Jason said, what is required now? Can you move a project up? You may be more surprised than you actually think. So lots of options out there. Are there any parting words anyone would like to say? Or I know, Jason, you had a question on the chat box as well. Maybe if you want to just reiterate it for anyone who didn't get a chance to read it.
Sure. I also want to just firstly address, Richard made a really good comment about when you do look at deferring projects, you're essentially just kicking it down the road, and costs could end up being higher. So it's really important to do that evaluation with your engineer to see what the actual implications are. Sometimes when you're doing a deferral and it results in like an immediate, like a special assessment or a boost in reserve contributions now, that's when it might make sense to do the deferral a little bit, because you can get a little cash relief now, but that project is going to be needed next year or the year after, and you're going to need that money. But for some condos, we find they're asking us, hey, what if we deferred these projects in our reserve fund study, but their contribution rates are just going up steadily? What if we defer this project, here or there? It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't really help them out that much. So it has to be something that's really in the immediate term, that's having an immediate financial impact on the corporation. So just wanted to mention that. In terms of some questions that came in, if I can find them. One is, are you finding the ability of reserve fund investments are able to keep up with the inflationary costs of repairs? This, talk about another condo talk. This could be a whole condo talk as well, because this is a great point. Reserve fund investments are getting essentially no money back, and construction inflation is outpacing CPI, which is your consumer price index inflation. It's probably about double that for construction inflation. So we're seeing a real, and the only way to make up that difference is adding more contributions. And then if you look over the long term of a corporation's financial picture, the condo fees start representing a higher and higher and higher percent of your total, the reserve contribution portion of your condo fee represents a higher and higher portion of your total fee, where it's getting to 50-50 and then even getting higher than 50-50. So it's a real long-term issue because of the low interest rate, high inflation rate scenario. So that was a really good question. And so what do you do about it? That's a whole condo talk.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, Richard, would you like to say anything? If not, we can.
I got 3 parting comments.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, leave it to a lawyer to talk too much. First off, with electronic communication, get those consents now. All right, you got a window, get it now. Same thing with number 2 are the virtual meetings. Get the bylaws in place now. We got leeway because of the emergency order where we don't need the bylaw in place. Technology's caught up where virtual meetings are they're happening all the time now. So get those bylaws in place. Number 3, back to the collection process, treat everything like it's going to end up in court. We don't want to be there. We don't want to get there. All right, so when you're doing reminders, if it's a verbal reminder, there's no evidence to that. All right, want it in writing. We want it addressed to we want the owner name, the address on the reminder, etc. They can be friendly, but make sure there's something that tangible we can then pick up if we need to pick it up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. So needless to say, these are very interesting times. Our goal at the Golden Horseshoe chapter is to provide these free Condo Talk webinars on a monthly basis to provide practical-based solutions. That's our approach. We want you to take away something that you can implement into your condo, or at least go back and talk to your boards of directors about and say, hey, we didn't think about this. Is it an option? Thank you to Jason, Michelle, and Richard for sharing your practices and practical solutions, and for all of you who are able to join us this afternoon. We do have some upcoming courses that are coming. All are free to members as well as non-members. So this first one is July 16th. It is holding a virtual AGM from 5 till 6:30. The next one is on July 21st. It is our next Condo Talk, and it will be on renovations. We're getting a lot of questions about, do we have a right to enter a unit? Can owners undertake renovations to their unit? What are access rights? What are notice requirements? And then we have the Intro to Condo course on the 13th of August. All are webinar based. You can call in or log in through your computer. We'd love to have you join. And at the end of the session, you will get a short survey to fill out. We would greatly appreciate your comments on what you liked, what you didn't like, what you'd like to see more of, hopefully not less of. But thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you to the panelists, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye.
Bye.